Is generative AI good? Is generative AI bad? Has this emerging technology doomed our creative minds? Hello everyone, my name is Alexander Bransby-Zachary, and first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming. So, artificial intelligence encompasses many different technologies, but today I'm going to be focusing specifically on generative AI, as it's a topic that I've explored personally, academically, and professionally. Artificial intelligence and generative AI, it encompasses artificial intelligence models capable of generating new content, whether it be text, video, audio, or interactive media. It learns from vast amounts of data, and then it learns patterns based on that data, and then it creates entirely new content. Everything I just said was generated from ChatGPT, a generative AI chatbot, so I came up with absolutely none of it. So, I have a background in digital media and design, which means that I make movies, I make cool stuff, and I'm on my phone absolutely all the time. So ChatGPT is a generative AI chatbot, and I'd like to give you my own definition of it, which is not generated by AI. Let us imagine a scenario. There's an enthusiastic student in a classroom, and a teacher is asking them a load of questions. The student may not understand what the questions actually mean, but they're trying to give the correct answer. They might not always be right, they might not always be wrong, and if you're lucky, they might even provide you with some unexpected, quirky facts. That student is generative AI. And it's important to note that over the last few years, that student has grown, and they provide more consistently correct answers, and I would say that especially they provide more context for their incorrect answers, making them seem more correct. But there's a risk associated with generative AI. It can do a lot of things, but there's a significant risk that it can replace our creative process, and that's the main risk we're going to go over today. And the creative process is something that everyone goes through, and they learn from a very young age, and it makes us into who we are. And there's two parts of this risk that I'm going to go over today in detail. One of them is our ownership. If I use generative AI to write one line of a script in a film, and then I release the film, was that ownership generative AI, or was it given to me? If I use generative AI to completely create an entire film for me, is that my film anymore? I think most of you would agree that it isn't anymore, because I'm not really having anything to do with the process. But where do we cross that line? And it's very hard to answer that question because generative AI is growing so quickly, and none of us are really experts on it at this point. So that line is always going to move. So in my field of live streaming and video content creation, generative AI has completely changed the way that I approach my work. Hang on, let's slow down for a second. So what is live streaming? I think a lot of you aren't as experienced or as informed, so let me just give you a good example. It's going to be exactly what live streaming is. So imagine a video call, imagine it's Zoom, or maybe some of you use WebEx, maybe some of you use Google Meets, any video conference tool. Imagine we're on a Google Meet or a WebEx, and there's unlimited people allowed into this video conference. Only one person has their microphone on and their camera on. Everyone else has their camera and microphone off, and everyone else is only wearing pants. And in America, that would just be underwear. They are praying that their boss does not ask them to turn their microphone on and say, "Good morning," and they're praying that their camera isn't turned on by accident so that their boss can't see the highly concerning state of their hair in the morning. Does this sound familiar to anyone? So, speed running is something that I do as part of live streaming. So I live stream myself speed running, and let me explain what speed running is. Speed running is playing a game fast. So now that we're on the same page with both of these things, let me explain how generative AI can actually help create this content. So it can help me uncover new routes in a video game to figure out what enemies are going to do, and it can also figure out the best route to take to gather tools and get through the game a little bit faster. In a live streaming context, it can also help me create dynamic overlays for my stream. It can provide me with real-time viewer interaction data so that I can bring my stream to the next level. Another thing, this is an intentional slide by the way, another thing that generative AI can help with is writer's block. Sometimes we just don't have ideas. Sometimes our brain, there's an off switch and we can't turn it back on. Generative AI is a great way to turn that switch on, to provide us with some ideas, some sparks, so that we can get our ideas going. But it's also important that we don't completely rely on generative AI to generate ideas, because creating an outline for a project, for example, as soon as we use generative AI to create that outline, we're then letting technology put us in a box. And that's not the point of generative AI, although no one really knows the point yet. In my opinion, is that we shouldn't be letting it put us in a box. We should use it as a tool to bring our own creative ideas to the next level. My envision of the future is that there's going to be an abundance of AI-generated content. There already is, actually. If you scroll through your feed, you're going to find AI-generated content, a lot of you, and a lot of you won't even know it's there, but it will be there. And a lot of content is just made by generative AI now. I believe that's only going to become more abundant into the future, and I believe that work that you may consider as good now might be considered mediocre in a few years, because there's going to be so much of it, and it's so accessible to create it from someone who doesn't even have experience. But I do think that the people who are committed to making their best work and to going through the failure process and trial and error, they're going to be able to use this as a tool and make their work even better. It just might be harder for us to find, because there's so much other content out there. Okay, I was going to talk about the traditional art forms that are also impacted by generative AI, such as painting, such as music, such as storytelling. But I can tell you're all getting a bit bored, so we're going to talk about something much more compelling. Barbie 2023. So this movie stars Margot Robbie and Ryan Gosling, and let's consider that I watched this movie, and the themes of empowerment, feminism, and societal image, I experienced growth from all of these themes. I would argue that the movie succeeded. Now let's say that generative AI had a significant role to play in making this film. Let's say that I still experienced the same growth from all of these themes, and it was still what the creators of the movie intended. Did the movie still succeed? I would argue that it did. Let's talk about Ryan Gosling. So Ryan Gosling plays Ken in the film, and Ryan Gosling would have had his own take on the character since he took on the role. Let's say one day, generative AI seemed sufficient to use for the day, and he didn't even need to come into work. He would not have been able to provide his insight into the character to frame the final movie. And what if that day something was put into the script and his experience with the character, he would have been able to add to it, something that generative AI cannot do because it doesn't have that human element, and it never will. Ryan Gosling is Ken. No one can change that now. He just is Ken. And generative AI can do so much already, and it's going to be able to learn how to do a whole lot more into the future. But there's one thing that I do know. Generative AI will never be Ken. So, what does any of this mean? Is art less about how we create art and more about what we produce? Is Ryan Gosling's emotional and personal journey of playing the character of Ken more important than the themes that I grow from the movie? I would argue that they are equally as important, and I would argue that both of them can be done using generative AI. It's important that we don't lose the creative process, which is so important in shaping us into who we are. And it's important that educational institutions teach our students and the parents teach their children how to retain that learning process, because it is so integral to us and who we are. And if those children and our current generations as well are able to use it responsibly and ethically, I do believe that we can bring our content to the next level with this powerful tool. Here's my vision of the future after saying all of this. I believe that generative AI, while it's a tool, it can also pose significant risks, and it can take away from what we connect with when we look at art. And art can be creating a film, it could be fixing a car. There's a creative process with both of these things. when I got offered this TED Talk 7 months ago, I was trying to think of a punchline or something that I could leave you with that would inspire you or make you feel less confused, just like I am with this technology. And the first thing I thought of was emotion. I thought, generative AI doesn't have emotion. And while that's true, I do see a future where generative AI is going to be used in schooling, and children are going to grow up using generative AI throughout their academic career. I also see it being used for therapeutic purposes, and I'm sure these things are already happening now, whether they should be or not. And I believe that a lot of people are doing it without real knowledge of how to do it properly. And while doing this, generative AI is gaining knowledge on how people feel emotions, and also, on the flip side, how generative AI can provide information to someone else and make them feel a certain way. And that's power. And that's very scary. So while generative AI cannot feel emotions, I do believe that it will gain a pretty good idea of what emotions mean and how they work, even if it can't feel them. But there's one thing that I did find out that generative AI doesn't have, and it never will have, no matter how powerful it gets. And if there's one thing that you leave with after this talk that I'd like you to remember when you go home, is that there is one thing that generative AI cannot do and never will be able to do, and will never have, that humans do have, and that's passion. Thank you.